Hey everybody, I am recording thoughts on part 2 of How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell. Um, I'm not going to make any effort to try to summarize the book. Um, Instead, I'm trying to just wrap my arms around how the various pieces of this book cohere together and to try to get a bird's eye view of the whole argument of the book, which is a little bit hard to do while you're reading it and while it's kind of unfolding piece by piece, not because the argument doesn't make sense, but just because it's more complex than you might expect from a book with a flowery cover. So I have basically going to chunk these reactions up into a couple parts. I want to start off by talking about the audience for the book and just an overview of the book's thesis. And then I want to talk about nothing, what the word nothing means in the title. And then that's going to go to the role of attention and how Odell thinks we should take the act of encountering seriously. Finally, the last two things I want to talk about are, I think she sees social media and bioregionalism as opposites, or she at least kind of pits them against each other and to show the contrasts between what she's reacting against and what she'd like to see instead. And then finally, there's a discussion of the role of context. We're trying to restore the concept of context, whether that's an online life by slowing down social media, or whether it's in the real world by paying attention to where you're at. So this book is somewhat different than what most of us thought it would be when we opened it up. When I say most of us, I'm talking about, my friends and those folks who are reading it along with me. And since the book is different from what we thought, it's kind of a wonder that this book has found its audience at all. But it is amazing because it did find its audience. I mean, I feel like in as much as she's talking about the things we care about and is giving terminology and voice to things that we had not previously had vocabulary to talk about. And I'll get into that as we go through. So I love the book. I'm just surprised that I picked it up, given that it was didn't turn out to be what I thought it was, but what it turned out to be was better than what I thought it was. So it's less self-helpy than maybe I thought it would be. Not that I'm a big self-help reader. But it's also not as activist-y as I imagined it would be. Instead, the book is kind of like trying to lay an intellectual foundation for people to build on, I think. The title of the book is How to Do Nothing, emphasis on the how. It's not necessarily about which nothing to do. Or maybe it's rather why to do nothing, instead of what exactly to do or not do. In fact, at some point, I think maybe in the conclusion, she specifically says she's resisted the urge to give a specific recommendation for what to do, which some readers might see as a little frustrating, but I think it makes sense in the overall scheme of the book. Okay, so the big question then is, what is nothing? And she approaches this question in lots of different ways throughout the text. Sometimes she says things like it's self-directed action against the flow. And she also said very astutely, quote, "I would be surprised if anyone who bought this book actually wants to do nothing." And that's a very good point because, people want to be productive and useful, and, even if they're not productive or useful, they still want to be busy. And that's been my observation. But she says, basically for her, I think nothing is like meaningful action as opposed to just random action. Meaningful action that's good for personal growth and good for the health of the world, but not monetizable or consistent, not necessarily monetizable, or consistent with the logic of commercial social media platforms that privilege shallow connections. Instead, the idea is to make real connections with others and with the world around us. So let's talk about what nothing is not. Odell says that it's not assimilating, it's not leaving, not simply refusing. And she spent some time at the early or middle part of the book talking about how meaningful acts of refusal come not directly from fear, not from anger or hysteria, but rather from clarity of action. And she talks about the importance of people organizing to achieve this kind of action. And so I think that it's an important part of the book's thesis that resistance to the urgent monetizable busyness of the dominant culture has to take place at the group level. Resistance has to take place at the group level as well as the individual level. And I'm all about that because I've certainly seen the power of community in my life. And so I endorse that 100%. And she talks about the futility of individual actions of refusal, like a strike, for example. You can't just, a strike won't work if you just do it by yourself. You have to, get everybody who's on the line to strike together in order for it to have a chance. So if she's had some things about what nothing is not, now let's talk about what nothing is. Near the end of the text, she gives us this phrase called manifest dismantling. And she also uses the word purposefulness. I'm looking at my notes here. I read the book in print, in part of it, and some of it I had in Audible as well. So I went back and forth and took notes as I went. She said she wants to give us a new direction for our work ethic, not just blindly moving forward and destroying things. She says that the nothing she's talking about is more than just logging off and refusing the influence of persuasive design techniques. I think, I don't think this word ever occurs in the text, but the word that comes to my mind when I think about the book I've just read is, citizenship. Just taking action and not thinking only about our rights, but also about our responsibilities as stewards. So she specifically says she refuses to conclude with a single recommendation about how to live. But she does talk about something that she calls the third state. So what is the third state? It is, she's talking about the third state of refusal, talking about boycott and resistance, and strikes. She talks about, too, how not everyone is equally privileged to engage in these kinds of acts of dissent, to go out and concern oneself with the health of a local ecosystem, or attend a city council meeting about the watershed, or to have the luxury to care about these things. But everyone does have something that they can do. She gives a lot of examples. And that brings us to the role of attention. And as I mentioned in my first video or audio recording, the role of attention really sticks out to me. In order to get to the importance of attention, one of the things she does is asks us to think about the kinds of things that go through our heads when we think about quitting Facebook. Talks about, there's a connection between attention and social media because social media is one of the things that tries to soak up our attention for its own purposes, robbing us of other purposes that we may be able to apply it toward. Talks about the impossibility of leaving Facebook and people who make a big deal about leaving Facebook. She suggests maybe fighting the right battle on the wrong plane. A lot of times when people make a political decision to leave Facebook, friends misunderstand that decision as an act of internet asceticism. And then she also reiterates the power to switch off. Brings up classism. And she says, rather, if you want to fight the problem, you need to fight the root of the problem. She says the roots of the problem are nothing less than the basic building blocks of late capitalism, deregulation, market fundamentalism, and privatization. Okay, so real refusal refuses the terms of the question itself. Think of Bartleby from Melville. She talks about a withdrawal of attention, not loudly quitting Facebook, but first and foremost, a refusal in the mind. Not once and for all an act of quitting, but an ongoing training. Investing attention somewhere. When you invest your attention, you can enlarge it and proliferate it. So then she gets into exercises in attention. And I don't know if she calls this chapter the phenomenology of seeing, or if that's just one of the notes that I put. But it's basically the phenomenology of seeing, a discourse on the subject of attention through the lens of a philosophy of art. And I'm reminded that the author is an artist and has lots of interesting things to say about art. One of the overall remarks on the book I wanted to make is that the attention economy is being addressed here because it is a force in our lives that doesn't want to let us do nothing. That is to say, social media makes it hard for us to engage our attentions on the important, non-monetizable stuff of life. So she gives us reasons to deepen our attention, reasons why it's important, and then ways to resist the attention economy, which is the subtitle of the book. Talks about how attention renders our reality, and that brings us to persuasive design, which Facebook is an example of, which is with its little red notifications giving us to-do lists, things we always need to try to get to the bottom of and never do and never really actually want to. She says persuasive design assumes a rather shallow form of attention and thinks we should expect more of ourselves. Talks about ways to remap our attention to include other things. When you buy a new car, when I was little, my mom and dad bought a white van. And whenever they bought a white van, suddenly there were white vans everywhere. And I never knew whether it was because there was just suddenly a flood of white vans on the street or whether my attention was remapped to notice them before. Also, when Breath of the Wild first came out, the Zelda game for the Switch and other consoles, I was, the character running through the woods, and it was so beautifully rendered. Like you could see the trees, the foreground, the middle distance, and the background, and the branches and the individual leaves. And holy cow, there's a troll. You want to run away from that troll. And after a few hours of playing Breath of the Wild, this video game, I would go outside and walk at the dog park or walk on one of the trails, and I would just be looking at the foliage totally differently than I did before, seeing the leaves and the foreground and the middle distance and the background, and just looked at it in a different way. And those are all examples of how what we choose to focus on and the ways we train ourselves to see the world matter. They really impact our quality of life. It's also interesting that realities are inhabitable. We can build a reality and then share it with others, as, for example, the video game programmers did for so many of us who enjoyed that game. The way you see the world is one thing, and then you can share your vision of the world with others. And so, speaking of others, she then gets into encountering others. And I feel like the chapter about the ecology of strangers is in there because it connects the social media material to the bioregionalism material. And bioregionalism is simply noting the flora and fauna of where you live, and also noting that you are We're organisms that live in a complex web with other organisms, and we're just remembering that we live on Earth, and our actions impact it. I love the part in the chapter about the ecology of strangers, about how thinking of the self as something separate from others and something separate from the world is a fallacy. I like how the author talks about how being yourself means something more than being a stable image of what you like and why, keeping that consistent, following recognizable patterns of habits, desires, and drives so that you can be advertised to. Being yourself means more than that. I like how she argues that spatial proximity has everything to do with this kind of being. Spatial proximity to other beings specifically. It's important when it comes to connecting with others and with the world. And again, this is all part of her nothing. You can't do this if you're doing something by the quote unquote world's standards, She says we need to get out of our filter bubbles so that we can increase our chances of having meaningful encounters with people who stand to change us significantly, and that our platforms are ill-designed for this. Our social media is ill-designed for it, and our neighborhoods are ill-designed for it too, as they're homogenous or otherwise isolating. I want to read a book she mentions by Gary Snyder called Practice of the Wild, I think it is. I'm excited to look into that someday. So chapter 6, Restoring the Grounds for Thought. This is the chapter about context, and so we're getting close to the end. Basically, context, she says, is what appears when you hold your attention open for long enough. The longer you hold it, the more context appears. So wise. I'm amazed by how, I don't know. So I'm raising trees right now. I'm trying to keep trees alive in pots. And I noticed one of these trees, a maple tree that I have in this little pot, I have a lot of the original dirt that it was growing in addition to dirt that I added. And sure enough, there's like a bunch of like little anthills in it now. So I must have transported some of that tree's context when I transplanted it. And I don't suppose it's any harm to anything to just leave them there. Anyway, this is off topic. So getting back to the book, context collapse. Talking with a friend of mine about this part really stuck out to him. And it stuck out to me too, how, like, for example, a tweet can be taken out of context on purpose just because they know the readers will have a knee-jerk reaction, will be offended by it, even though it's in its original context. The tweet was not offensive, was well considered. But it doesn't matter. That person's career is now over. It doesn't matter if Vox or some other website people read, fact check it or not. The damage is done. As someone said, basically on Twitter, every day there's a new person who is quote unquote it. And the goal of Twitter is not to be it. And so there's just a Twitter mob wanting to, shake their fists at someone no matter what. It was something that stuck out to me about context collapse. It has to do with the difference between letters sent through snail mail and an email. She talks about instantaneality, if that's a word, instantaneousness, flattens out the past, the present, and the future into one constant amnesiac present. And, I love sending letters to people because I can write the letter, I can proofread the letter, I can rewrite it, got to fold it up and put it in the envelope and seal it and use my wax seal and address it and put the stamp and send it through the mail. It takes a few days, and then it takes a few days for the person to read it and open it and digest it and all that. Versus a text message or an email, where you dash the thing off and you send it and it's just immediately there, and you want to reply in like 2 seconds or less, or at least email, a work email has to be, answered by end of day or whatever. And so to me, the writing letters is it's the slower, but also like more humanly paced context that it allows for more. That doesn't just allow, but it kind of encourages more thought, more rumination, more consideration, versus just dashing something off, shoot you an email, as the phrase is. And so when she talked about how the past, present, and future being smushed together into just one instant of time, the constant present, that really resonated to me. That's what electronic communication does. Everything is instant, and that we lose something when everything is instant. We lose the context for thought, or the grounds for thought, which is the title of the chapter that she's talking about. She also says that fast, quick, short messages aren't good for politics. Not good because in other ways too, it creates weak ties, just emotional reactions. We're not really engaging in a shared project or understanding something together. Anyway, then just some good reflection too on parks and just all the things we take for granted. She slaps my hand and says, "Stop that." I grew up thinking parks were leftover spaces, but in fact, parks allow us to inhabit the different kinds of attention. Plus, every park that exists, someone had to fight for it, probably against some real estate developer who wanted to put something gaudy there instead. So I think if I were characterizing this book overall, one way I would do it is I think individuals who are religious might call this book maybe a secular spirituality of fresh air, because she's just rhapsodizing about going outside. Near the end, it talks about how she was at a tech conference, but went outside and got distracted by the birds. And pretty soon she was like, "What kind of bird is this? What kind of tree is it in?" So what I would like to read next that this book didn't give us is maybe just a handbook for environmental activism, how to do things that are meaningful, that keep pollutants out of the water. And because I do want to put down roots where I am, not only my neighborhood, but my town, my continent, my planet, So what can I do about that beyond my purchasing choices? I don't know. And she says, when you become interested in the health of the place where you are, whether ecological or cultural, you'll see more destruction than progress. And so that's what makes me want to learn more about, environmentalism, so that I can contribute to the progress and not be contributing to the ongoing destruction. She says, when you care about a place, you sit in the place, you start to look around, and then when you give your attention to some place, you start to care about that place because you realize it is irreplaceable. And it's the same exact thing with people and with relationships as well. Anyway, if you haven't read the text, if you haven't read the book, I really recommend it. She covers so many great topics, drops a lot of interesting names, and just in terms of quotes, she goes from Diogenes to Melville to Cicero to Thoreau to Wendell-Berry. Lots of great quotes, some by others and some, I think, minted newly by the author. She quotes Wendell-Berry as saying, "I have thrown away my lantern and I can see the dark." Whatever that means is very poetic. So if we back up and get a 10,000-foot view of the book, we see that it is complex, and it is more about a foundation for how to think about things rather than specifically how to do things. And I think that that's okay, because other sorts of handbooks and stuff have been written. But the niche that this book is trying to fill in a world that is where people are, including myself, we're all reliant on technology, and now more than ever in the pandemic. Without social media, what would we do? How would we stay connected? How would we work without the platforms that have been built for us? Nevertheless, um, it's nice to have someone say, look, a lot of this sucks, and we don't have to say, well, I'm obligated for the rest of my life to live in a world we've specifically built that's terrible because it's good for someone else. She says there has to be a way that we can opt out, but not just drop off the grid and sit on our hands forever, but to build something new instead, or to reject the not only refuse to answer the question, but to reject the premise of the question and to ask different questions instead, And so I think there's a lot of I don't know, positivity and optimism if even in the act of trying to show people the sheer scale of the problem, and the problem is the attention economy. And the book is about how to resist it. So anyway, I found it thought-provoking and interesting. Overall, I liked it. And I'm excited to go on and read some other things in this vein. So anyway, I would love to hear about how you liked the book. And if you have listened to this entire video, then you get a cookie. Let me know, and I'll make sure someone gets you a cookie. Thanks. Have a good one.